It's amazing how so many dead bodies of royals and well-known people just weren't allowed to rest in peace. So here's a collection of some of our favourite videos from TikTok about some coffin openings.
While we're on the subject of opening up kings' coffins, King John didn't get away with it either. He died in 1216 at Newark Castle, but he was buried at Worcester Cathedral. Bit of a trek. In 1797 there was a dispute about where exactly the coffin was in the church, and they decided to open up one of the coffins. Any excuse. They found the king, and they described that he was 5'6.5" tall, or long, I guess, at that point. And they described that they found a sword, the remains of a sword and scabbard next to the body. They also described how thousands of people flocked to take a peek at the remains before they closed it up again. If you're really bored, you can read an account of the opening of King John's coffin at the British Library. I'll see you there.
Should we open up another coffin? Because you're going to love this one. This is William Longspray. He was the 12th, 13th century Earl of Salisbury. He was the illegitimate son of King Henry II, and he was a bit of a badass. So he spent quite a bit of time fighting alongside his half-brother Richard the Lionheart in France. But when Richard died, he came over to England and he sided with his other half-brother John. In 1226 his days were up, and he was the first person to be buried at the wonderful Salisbury Cathedral. But there was a mystery. It was alleged that he'd been poisoned, though nobody could prove it. I mean, he wouldn't be the last person to be poisoned in Salisbury. In 1791 his coffin was opened, and they found inside his skull the wonderfully preserved mummified remains of a black rat. When that rat was analysed, it was found to be full of our old friend arsenic. Now that rat, poor creature, is now on display at the Salisbury Museum, which is near the cathedral. Absolutely brilliant day out. Highly recommend it. Don't lick the rat. You want another coffin opening? Okay, we just couldn't leave Catherine de Valois alone to rest in peace. She was the wife of Henry V, and after he died, she secretly married a chap called Owen Tudor, and they had lots of Tudor children. And we know how that ended. But anyway, back to Catherine. She died and was buried at Westminster Abbey. But a couple of hundred years later, in 1667, you could go and pay the Abbey staff to go and see her corpse. I'm not sure why hers specifically, but you could. And Samuel Pepys did just that on his 36th birthday. It was a Shrove Tuesday. He should have been at home having pancakes, but no, he went to see the Queen. He held her and he kissed her on the lips. And he wrote in his diary, "Today I did kiss a queen." Okay, Sam, I mean, she's 200 years old. Put her down. There are loads of these. We just couldn't leave the monarchs alone. We were opening coffins all over the place. So give us a follow and we'll do some more. You want to know if Richard II was left to rest in peace? Well, you probably know what I'm about to say. A body that was claimed to be that of Richard II, who had died of starvation at Pontefract Castle in 1400, was buried initially in Hertfordshire, but Henry V, he felt a little bit bad about what went down, so he dug him up and he moved him to Westminster Abbey to be beside his wife, Anne of Bohemia. And there they were left alone to rest in... not quite. In 1871 the tomb was opened up and they had a look to see if there was any evidence of trauma in the skulls and the bones, and they didn't find any. They drew sketches of the skulls and the bones, and they had a look at what else was in there, remnants of gloves and those wonderful pointy shoes. Recently, in the archive of the National Portrait Gallery, those skull pictures and bone pictures have been found, along with a cigarette box that was dated 1871 Westminster Abbey, which had in it a little piece of wood thought to be from the coffin, and also fragments from the gloves and the shoes. And are they going to put them back? Probably not. You're right, and what happened to Catherine Parr's body was really sad. So she was the surviving wife of Henry VIII, and when he died, she remarried, but sadly she died in childbirth in 1548. Her body was well embalmed, wrapped in the waxy cloths and sealed in lead, and she was buried in the chapel of Suzie Castle in Gloucestershire. The castle didn't fare well during the Civil War and was ruined, and her grave was all but forgotten, until the 1700s when some sightseers came a-digging, and they dug her up. And what they found was the most magnificently well-preserved body, but they didn't really like that and they put her back, but the seal had been broken. The landowner came and did the same thing, took some hair and put her back. But then they had this drunken party who came along and they dug her up and they desecrated her body. They threw it on a rubbish heap for public view. She was rescued and buried again, but then she was exhumed for an autopsy. But eventually in 1817 she was put in a tomb and hopefully can rest in... Yes, we're still going on about opening coffins, and this is Edward IV. He's no exception. Edward IV died in 1483 and was buried at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. In 1789, some restoration work was being carried out. It's always used as an excuse, and they opened his lead coffin for restoration work, apparently. But they had a look, and what they found was some hair on his skull, some long hair there, and some short hair on his neck. And his feet were immersed in about 3 inches of this brown liquid. Now, a Windsor physician analysed the liquid, and he concluded that this was dissolution of Edward's body. I mean, we could have told him that. Was he left alone? Put back? Not quite. They did take relics. They took some of his hair, and they took a phial of that brown liquid. As you do. Alas, poor William, I knew nothing. Actually, nobody knows what happened to William Shakespeare's skull. It has been accepted that trophy hunters might have stolen the skull from his shallow grave more than 200 years ago. But we don't know if his head and the rest of his body are separated because, incredibly, nobody's been a-digging. Archaeologists have done ground-penetrating radar studies, and they've shown that the head end, there is a disturbance of his grave, possible evidence of tampering. The story from 1879 goes that a chap called Frank Chambers was paid 300 guineas to go and steal the head. He didn't use any shovels, he got in there with his hands because he didn't want to break the precious treasure. Hopefully the eyes had gone. He then hid it in a local church, and a skull in the church has long been thought to be Shakespeare's, turned out to be that of a 70-year-old woman. So somewhere out there is Shakespeare's head, and it could well be on the set of Sherlock. I wonder if it's met Andrew Scott. You want to hear that Catherine of Aragon was left alone to rest in peace, but sadly she makes it to our list of coffin opening stories as well. She was the first wife of Henry VIII, pushed aside for Anne Boleyn and thoughts of a living male heir. She believed herself to be the one true queen until the day she died in January 1536. Her body was taken, internal organs removed, and the cavities packed with straw and herbs. The salves of salt and spices were rubbed onto the skin and muscles. She was wrapped in wax linens and encased in lead, and she was interred at Peterborough Cathedral. And in the 1600s, Cromwell's troops ransacked the place, but the body was left undisturbed until 1777, when it was opened up for a look. Amazingly, because you've heard my other stories, amazingly it was thought disrespectful to fully open the coffin. So they drilled a hole in the lead and poked in a wire and pulled out some stuff. It turned out to be some cloth that disintegrated in the air. What was it with stealing all these skulls? And Lord Darnley's went missing as well. Lord Darnley was the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, and when their son James was only 8 months old, Darnley was murdered. The house that they were lodging at Kirkerfield in Edinburgh was blown to pieces, and he was found in the garden with his valet, both men smothered to death. He was embalmed by the Queen's apothecary for £40 and was interred at Holyrood, and he was still there in 1668 when a mob came and ransacked the place, and he was still there 100 years later when the roof caved in. In about 1778, someone broke in and stole the skull and some bones. And they maybe turned up at Sotheby's for auction in the 1860s, sold for bric-a-brac. And there were 2 possible skulls going about, one in Edinburgh and one at the Royal College of Surgeons. And in 2016, a researcher called Emma Price compared reconstructions to portraits. The one in Edinburgh? Not him. The one in the Royal College of Surgeons? Maybe, but it was destroyed in the Blitz.